Hello and welcome to the Quilt Addicts Anonymous beginner quilting video tutorial series. I'm Stephanie Soebbing. In this video, I'm going to show you how to prepare your binding, how to sew it onto the front of your quilt, join it in continuous binding, trim your quilt sides, and how to sew it to the back by hand. So we've got a lot to cover, but this is a final step in your quilt, and then we'll talk about a label and how to care for your quilt in the final video for this series. So excited, I hope you are too. This is always a fun part to see the quilt finished, and this is going to be a lot of fun to see all of your quilts finished. So make sure you are sharing those. Tag us on Instagram at Quilt Addicts Anonymous so we can see all of your first quilts that you're making using this pattern. QT Fabrics proudly sponsors this video tutorial series from Quilt Addicts Anonymous. Make sure you join in the fabric fun over at qtfabrics.com. They imagine so you can create. All right, so I've got my quilt ready to go. I'm going to move that to the side for a little bit. And then I have my binding strips. I've already cut these to 2.5 inches by width of fabric, which it tells you to do in your pattern. You can download that for free at shop.quiltaddictsanonymous.com. We'll have a link to it in the description for this video, but you can also get it by searching for Split 9 Patch. When you download the pattern, we're also going to send you a free coupon code that you can use to save on everything that you need to make this first quilt over at shop.quiltaddictsanonymous.com. Now, I cut mine to 2.5 inches wide because I feel like that's a good width for beginners to work with. So I do that for all of my patterns because I'm assuming that this could be somebody's first quilt. Once you get the hang of binding, you can always make that a little skinnier. 2.25 is a really common number that people use once they get a little bit better at this, but definitely start out at 2.5 for your first one by width of fabric. So when I'm getting ready to do this, what I do is I lay everything out and I have my strips lined up so that the selvage is right next to me, pointing towards me, and then the fold is going off towards the side. Because when I put these together, I want to put them together at a right angle, and this way I can just kind of grab and it's already in the position I need it to be in, so I have to think less when I'm doing this. Now with one strip going off to the left and the other strip perpendicular to it so that it's coming toward you, you want to lay these over each other with right sides together, and you want them to be crossing at right angles. And what I do when I'm joining these is I will let this hang off a little bit for a couple reasons. One, you're going to have to trim off the selvage anyway. And two, then when you're sewing, you can clearly sew from where these points come together to where these points come together, and you're not having to make sure that you sew exactly from corner to corner. We will do that for the final join when we join our strips for continuous binding, but for right now, this is a lot easier and it kind of gets you the hang of what you're doing. Now, once you've done this a few times, you don't need to go through the pinning process. I certainly don't when I am doing it, but for your first time, what I would do is I would pin across where you're going to be sewing. So I'm going to be sewing from here to here, and so I've got my pins going across from there to there as well. This next step is one that you also won't have to do once you get comfortable with it, but it's a good idea to do it when you're getting started so that way you know exactly what you're supposed to be doing. So I want to sew from where this point meets to where these points meet. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to draw a line so that's really easy to see. You don't need anything fancy, just something that's going to show up, but I would not use an ink pen because that could bleed on your fabric when you go to wash it for the first time. So it doesn't need to really be a continuous line, just something that you're going to see clearly as you sew to kind of give you an eyeball so you can sew a nice straight line here. Now, one thing you might want to do before you start sewing is kind of open it up a little bit. Obviously, I've got some pins in here, so it's not going to open up all the way, but when this is sewn, this should be one straight line. And if it is not looking like it's a straight line, if it looks like it's going to be at a right angle, then you have orientated something wrong. So go back to the drawing board, make sure you have your strip that's facing up going out to the left and your strip that's facing down pointing toward you. So I have my regular presser foot on for this step, and I have put my needle in the center position. And what I'm going to do here is just kind of line it up with that center line that I drew, and I'm going to go ahead and start sewing. All right, so I've sewn right down that line that I drew, and now when I open it up, this should be really even. So it is, it's really even at the top and then also at the bottom. If you're a little off and it isn't perfectly straight, it's not the end of the world. It depends on how far you're off. If it's 1/8 of an inch or so off, you're fine, just leave it. If it's more than that, then go ahead and rip your seam and do it one more time. Now, once you are satisfied with the way that this looks, you wanna trim off the extra. And you wanna get it to about a 1/4 inch seam. And this doesn't need to be exact, but you don't want it to be too skinny because the binding is gonna get the most wear and tear of any piece of your quilt because you're pulling at it, you're tugging at it, you're tucking it under your chin. So you wanna make sure that you take your time at this step. So here's where it's important to have this strip set just right next to me ready to grab. So what I can do now is I can take the strip that I just sewed, I can lay it on top just the way we did the other ones, and then I can pin, draw my line, and sew. I've done this a few times, so I'm gonna skip that part and I'm just gonna go ahead and sew here. But go ahead and do this for all the strips that you need for this pattern to create one long binding strip. So this is definitely a project that's easier to do on an actual ironing board, but I'm gonna show you on my little cutting mat here. So you wanna take the tail of your binding and you're gonna put it wrong side up, and you're gonna fold it over just like this, hot dog style, getting your ends to match. And then with your ends matching, you just wanna kinda run your iron down, and you're going to go all the way across your entire multi-strip piece of binding doing this, because you wanna fold it in half. And again, if it's not super perfect in half, not the end of the world, but you don't want it to be so far off that you're gonna have trouble catching both of the sides when you're sewing. That would be a problem. You would not wanna do that. So when you're getting close to one of these seam joins, what you want to do is you can either press it open or you can press it to one side. I usually press to one side on mine, and it's just a personal preference. There's multiple ways to do anything correctly in quilting, so if you prefer it open, no big deal. If you want it pressed to the side, that's okay too. And when you get to that point, just fold it over, press it down just like everything else. All right, so keep pressing all the way down until your entire roll of binding is pressed in half. So I like to roll my batting up, and I do that by just wrapping it around my fingers like this, going around and around. And I just really like this because it makes this really cute little roll to work with, and then my batting isn't hanging off on the floor. And if it is a little bit of time between when I finish the quilt top, quilting it, and when I do the binding, I could just sort of set this off to one side and everything's nice and ready to go. And it's just waiting for me for when I get to the point where I'm gonna do binding. I'm gonna show you this next part with the overhead camera and not on the sewing machine. We'll get to it on the sewing machine, but I think it'll make more sense if you can see it from above rather than trying to work around my hands in the sewing machine. All right, so I've got my binding ready to go here. And I have the raw edge, which is this part. Here's the folded edge. I'm gonna line that up even with the edge of my quilt so you can see it's nice and even there. Now I wanna have a tail that is about the width of, or the length of half of a block. So here's half of a block from here to here. So I'm not gonna start sewing this down until about here because I want to make sure I have this free to work with for when we do continuous binding. It doesn't really matter what side you start on because we're gonna join the ends when we're done sewing the binding to the top of the quilt, but you do want to make sure that you're not too close to an edge when you get started. I usually like to start in the center of my quilt. So when you look at your walking foot, each one is going to be a little bit different, but for mine, when I measure it out, this edge right here is a 1/4 inch from the center. So what you want to do is get your ruler, And just like we measured for our 1/4 inch presser foot, we also want to measure to figure out where our 1/4 inch is on our walking foot. So for me, that's going to be right at the outside edge of that metal part, right before where this upper feed dog is. So when I'm sewing, I'm going to line it up so that I can just barely see the edge of this fabric in this opening where the feed dogs are. Because if I do that, then I'm going to be sewing a 1/4 inch away from the edge of my fabric. So make sure you measure your own walking foot to figure out where that is on yours. And so what I'm going to do is I'm going to start sewing right here, and I'm going to stitch all the way down, and I'll show you that on the sewing machine, and then I'll take it out and show you how to do corners as well, like this. So I've got my machiner's quilting gloves on for this step. I find it really helpful. It helps me grip everything. And then I take my roll of binding and I just set that off to the side right in front of my machine, so it's right there. I don't have to go too far. Go ahead and bring this over. Just like when we were quilting, you want to get as much of the bulk on the table as possible so that it's not kind of hanging down. All right, so I want to make sure I leave myself a good tail so that way we can do that continuous binding later. I've got the raw edges of my binding lined up with the raw edges of my quilt top. So I'm going to go ahead and stitch 3 forward, and then I'm going to stitch 3 back, and I'm going to start sewing here. I'm going to go ahead and swap that thread to the back. So when you're doing this, just like when we were sewing and we really only kind of wanted to worry about what was on top of our sewing machine throat plate, same deal here. So I'm going to line up my edges of my fabric binding with the edges of my quilt top, and that's maybe like 4 inches, and I'm going to hold it in back just to guide it. So I just want this guiding it. And when I get to a point where I've held it still long enough, then I just reposition everything, get everything nice and laid flat here. You also want to make sure you're not sewing your backing fabric underneath. That's really easy to do if you're not paying attention. I'm going to go ahead and line that up again, get the raw edges of my binding fabric even with the raw edges of that quilt. And then keeping it in line with where I know a 1/4 inch seam is on my walking foot, just keep on stitching. All right, so I'm gonna keep on sewing until I'm about a couple inches away from the edge of the corner, and then I'll show you how to do a mitered corner. Okay, I'm almost to the corner, and what I wanna do is sew until I'm about a 1/4 inch away from where the edge of my quilt is. If you are new and that seems very scary and hard to do, just measure it. Just line the edge of your ruler up and then put a pin in right where your 1/4 inch mark is and where you need to stop. I'm going to eyeball it. I'm about a 1/4 inch away. I'm going to reinforce my stitches here just a little bit so we have a good secure corner. Now normally you would turn the corner and do this all in the sewing machine. I'm going to cut my threads and so I can show you how to do this on the overhead camera. But if you're doing this at home, you would not want to break your thread. You would just want to lift up your presser foot. And what I normally do is I'll turn it all towards me like this with the needle down. And then I lift my sewing machine needle up, and then I'm going to turn the corner, usually within here. Actually, I'll just show you. So what I do at this point is I want to pull it out just a little bit, and then I want to fold my binding fabric back so that my edges are now even with the edge that is now facing me that I haven't sewn on yet. And I should have a 45-degree angle going straight out into that corner. Then I'm going to fold it back toward me. And now there should be a nice fold that's even with the edge that I just stitched, and now the raw edges should be even with the raw edge of the quilt, and there should be a little corner here that is open, and that's going to get flipped around to the other side when we sew it down by hand. I'm going to go ahead and break my thread and show that to you on the overhead camera so that you can see it really clearly. Okay, pretend you're on your sewing machine and you just flipped everything around. What you're going to do is, with this part right underneath your machine, you're going to flip the binding back so that the raw edges are even with the edge of your quilt. And you're gonna fold it back down toward you and get those raw edges nice and even with the raw edge of your quilt top. And then there should be a fold up here that's even with the top of the line that you just folded. And then there's this little corner that should be flopping open. So now when you start sewing, you're gonna start sewing right in the corner here. I reinforce my stitches a little bit, and then you're just gonna sew all the way down. All right, I've got everything repositioned. I'm gonna go ahead and sew a couple of stitches forward and back. And now I'm just gonna keep sewing all the way down and repeat that process for every single corner. Now, one thing that I do that not everybody does is I do not trim my quilt top to size until I'm done with all the binding. The reason is I really like to have this feed dog on the side have something to grip onto, and it does when I still have a little bit of batting and backing hanging off, whereas otherwise I feel like it's constantly wanting to shift, and you already have enough to kind of battle with the whole weight of the quilt. So I feel like any extra favors you can give yourself, the better. So that's why I don't trim. So go ahead and repeat this process until you're about 1 foot away from where we started with the binding. All right, I've sewed all the way around my quilt, but I've left about 1 block free so I can show you how to do continuous binding. So I didn't do continuous binding for the longest time because I thought it was really scary. And then when I finally did it, I was like, this is so easy. I can't believe I haven't done it all this time. So what I'm gonna do is I'm going to go ahead and snip off the selvage here, and so that I've got a nice parallel line to work with. Then I'm going to line up my ruler even with the edge that I just cut, and I'm going to lay with the quilt nice and flat, everything down, and I'm going to cut right at the 2.5 inch mark because our binding is 2.5 inches wide. So if you did a thinner binding, you would want to cut at whatever the width is. So now I've got a nice little overlap here of exactly 2.5 inches from where when this binding ends to where when this binding begins. So now what we're going to do is you want to scrunch it up a little bit because you need to be able to like get in there and work. You're going to line up your corners just like that, and keeping that pinched, I kind of walk my fingers over just a little bit so that way I'm right in that corner. And once I've got that secure, I'll take some pins and I'm going to pin so that the point of my pin is coming out right around where the point of this fabric is. Now I'm going to do the exact same thing, this time going down the other corner. So I'm going to line up those points again and kind of walk my fingers down to get this nice and even. So now I've got my point right here. So in this case, I'm going to take my pin and I'm going to put it in right where that point is and have it kind of going down the diagonal. So before, when we were sewing all these, we had a little bit hanging off the top and the side. So we were able to see it's basically sew from valley to valley. In this case, you're not going to be able to do that because you have to sew exactly from point to point in order for that to work. So what you want to do at this point, especially for your first time, is definitely grab your pencil and draw that line from point to point so you have a guide on what to sew on. So I can tell easily where my point is here, and then I know that my point is right down here because that's where I put my pin in. So I'm going to go ahead and draw those lines, give myself a nice guide of where to go. Now, even though I sewed the rest of these binding strips together with my regular presser foot, I'm not going to take my walking foot off to do this. I'm just going to go ahead and start sewing. It'll be a little bit weird at first because there's a whole lot of movement in that walking foot that's really unnecessary for such a small piece, but it's way more efficient to just go ahead and sew with it on. All right, so you really want to kind of scrunch up the quilt so that way this part lies nice and flat when you're working with it. And I'm following that line that I drew, but I can see that it's coming off to the side a little bit. So what I'm gonna do is I'm gonna pull that pin out, and I can see that my corner is right here. So I'm just gonna aim for that. Even though it's not exactly on my line, it's more important to hit that corner. So now before you trim this, you need to make sure that it lies nice and flat. So when I lay this out, everything is nice and flat. It's not tugging, it's not way too loose. So I'm gonna be okay to go ahead and trim this off. And I normally don't take this to the iron at this point. I'll just kind of finger press it to the side, and usually that does the trick. Now what you can do here, in order to avoid having to ease anything in, like say you have just a little bit extra, what you can do is you can put a couple of pins in. So I'm gonna put a pin in here through all the layers, in the center of where it's loose, and then on the sides to kind of quarter that off. And then I kind of have some points where things can get eased in a little bit if they need it, just like when we were putting our blocks together. All right, so I'm gonna start sewing about an inch or so before where I stopped, and then I'm gonna continue sewing an inch or so past where I began originally. That'll help just lock those seams in real nicely. Make sure I take those pins out. I did put my machiner's quilting gloves back on. I really will not quilt or bind without these. It really helps me grip and makes this whole process a lot easier. So if you're on the fence on whether or not you need them, I highly, highly recommend them. And whenever we teach this class in person, people will start off without them, and then about halfway through they're like, just give me the gloves, and they have such an easier time. All right, we are done with the sewing machine, and we're gonna do the rest of it by hand. I would recommend doing this next part on whatever table you layered and basted your quilt on, as it is nice to have a large work surface to help have the weight of the quilt on. So now we need to cut off all this extra. So what I'm doing here is I'm going to line up my ruler with the edge of my binding, all the raw edges of the quilt and binding here. And what you wanna be careful of when you're doing this is we don't want to clip this corner when we trim with the rotary cutter. So when you lay it out, you want to make sure that you've got a little bit of space beyond where that piece is. The other thing you could do to make sure you don't clip it is to just fold it down away from the edge. And then you're sure not to clip that folded corner where we did our miter. See, there we got it nice and trimmed, and we didn't clip this at all. If you do clip it, you're in trouble. You're gonna have to redo your binding. So be very careful when you go around the corners. Now there's no rule that says that just because your ruler is 2 feet long that you have to cut 2 feet of binding at one time. If your binding is a little bit wobbly on the side, that's okay. Just cut whatever you can cut straight and then readjust and go from there, because you want it to be nice and even with the edges of your binding and your quilt top, because that's what we're gonna fold over to the back side when we sew. And if you have extra stuff in there to ease in, that's a problem. So like up here, I'm giving it a little tug to get it where I want it to be. You can also tug from the other side to get it nice and straight. The main thing here is just to get it as even with this side as possible. You don't want this to be too skinny. You want to maintain that 1/4 inch seam, but you also don't want to have too much extra, or your binding is going to be really kind of hard to work with because you're going to be trying to fold too much under. You can keep these batting scraps if you want. There are some cool projects out there that use them. All right, now once we get up here, in this case, the fold is going to the top, so I don't have to be careful when I am trimming this corner. other than to make sure that I'm in line with the edge. And then you're going to turn everything. And you're going to repeat that process. You can fold this a little bit back, get it out of the way, lay your ruler down, double check that everything is nice and in line, and it is, and that you are not going to clip your corner. And then go ahead and trim. So go ahead and keep doing that until you've trimmed all the excess batting and backing so that everything is even with the edges of your binding and your quilt top. Now it's time to hand sew the binding to the back. Some people do this by machine, but I really prefer the look of hand binding. So curl up in front of your favorite Netflix show or a movie and just have fun with this. All right, so I would recommend using thread that's going to match your binding fabric. But so you guys can see it, I'm going to use a light gray, but normally I would use a black for this. And I also have a nimble thimble. I really like these. They've got this metal plate at the tip of it. This one is too small for my finger and I can't find the one that fits. I lost it when I was at Quilt Market. So I'm gonna do it without it, but I definitely recommend using a thimble for this because otherwise you're gonna get a callus on your finger. I have used a Band-Aid in the pinch where I put the pad of the Band-Aid on the inside of my middle finger. So I highly recommend a thimble for this part. You need a pair of little scissors and then you need some needles. The bigger the eye, the better. All right, so first I'm gonna teach you how to do a quilter's knot. You wanna take a thread, like the thread that's about from your wrist to your elbow and snip that off. Any shorter and then you're replacing your thread all the time, and any longer and you can get it all tangled up and that's not fun. Then I'm gonna choose a needle. I'm going kind of with a medium length needle. These are really long. They are GoldenEye milliners. We have these at the shop. They're super, super long, but they do the job. All right, so I'm gonna thread my needle here. And fun tip, one side of the eye of the needle is larger than the other side. So if you're having trouble getting it through, just try turning the needle around and maybe that will work better for you. All right, so now we're going to do a quilter's knot. So I'm gonna take the edge of the thread that I just cut and I'm gonna place it going in the opposite direction of the pointy end of the needle. Then I'm gonna pinch that together with my left hand. And I'm gonna wrap the thread around 3 to 4 times. We'll do 4 this time. And then you kind of pull that down and I've got everything pinched. Maybe kind of hard to see on this camera, but all those thread loops are pinched in between my thumb and forefinger. Now keeping that pinched, I'm going to pull the needle out and pinch it along that length of thread, and now I have a nice little knot down there, and I didn't have to worry about how to, you know, get all my little loops and knots in the same place. It just works really well. So feel free to bookmark that section and watch it a couple of times. So when you bind a quilt, you start off with it sewn to the front of the quilt, and that edge that we folded over is going to flip over. So I'm gonna fold this to the back, and I'm gonna flip that down. Now, this is really a tactile feel thing. When you pinch your binding, you should feel that the batting goes all the way to the edge of where your binding is. You shouldn't feel like a gap where there's no binding, and you shouldn't feel a bump where it's kind of rolled over back on itself. That's something that you kind of get the hang of as you go along and you feel it. All right, so once I like the placement of that, I'm gonna take my needle and I'm gonna start an inch or so away, and I'm bringing the needle in through the backing and the batting fabric, and then I'm coming out right on the fold of that. So if I flip this over, you can't see the needle at all. When you're doing binding, you just want to work with the backing fabric and the batting. You never want to see your stitches from the front. So I've got that needle coming out right on the fold of that fabric from the binding, and I'm going to be quiet because you're going to hear a little pop when this comes through. You didn't hear it so good, but the needle sort of popped through the thread, and so that's called burying your stitch. So now you can't see it at all. So what I'm going to do next is, this is a blind stitch. So I'm putting my needle into the backing fabric right underneath where my thread came out. And I'm going to travel over about 1/4 inch or so Again, just in the batting fabric. So you cannot see it at all from the front. And then I'm coming out again right on the fold of the binding. And then I pull that tight. Some people will load up a couple of stitches on here, and if you're good with that, then go ahead, by all means do it. I like to do just one stitch at a time. So again, I'm going in with my needle in the backing and batting, right underneath where that thread came out. And I'm coming out on the fold of the fabric, maybe like 1/4 to 3/8 inch away from there. I've seen people make marks on their thumbs so they know how far apart to space these. It's a little pen so it comes off easy. And I don't really worry about like what's going on all the way down here. I just worry about like in the next couple of stitches, do I have that binding folded over nicely? Because you could really drive yourself nuts getting this all perfect, and then inevitably it's not going to be perfect when you get there. So again, we're just continuing to put the needle into the batting and backing right underneath where the thread has come out, traveling through the batting and backing so that we do not see it on the front side. And then bring your needle out right on that fold. And if you do this right and you use a blending thread, you're never gonna see this thread. Like even here, you can just see little dots of white here. You may not even be able to pick that up on camera because it's a blind stitch. You just don't see it. All right, so I'm going to keep on doing this stitch until I get to the corner, and then I'm going to show you how to turn that mitered corner. One tip on this, ideally you're going to have the same amount of batting wrapped around to the back, but that's not always the case. You know, maybe you took a little bit fatter seam in some places than others. So what you want to do is make sure that it's even on this side, that it looks nice and straight and it has about the same amount. So as long as you have cut a 1/4 inch seam and you are really good about folding this over so that that batting is filling all the way to the edge, then it's going to look great on the front, even if it maybe is a little wobbly on the back. Because I would always rather have it be wobbly on the back where you're not going to see it than on the front where you will. Okay, so I've almost reached the corner. What I'm going to do is I'm going to stitch all the way to the edge here. So that way I'm creating a nice right angle here. All right, so I've got that needle coming out right at the edge of where my fabric is. Now I'm going to take my needle and I'm going to put it in to the batting and backing right at the base of where that binding is, and I'm going to flip it over and I'm going to bring it out right in this point right here. And sometimes it takes a little figuring to make that work. There we go. All right, so I've got that needle coming out right in the corner. Now you've got a little bit of a fold here, and I want to tack that down. So usually one stitch is all it takes. I'm just kind of stitching in between those folds. And again, nothing is happening on the back side right now. It's all happening within the quilt. So now I'm going to take my needle right where that thread came out and I'm going to poke it straight through to the opposite side, because we've got to get back to the back here. I'm going to turn my quilt because now I'm going to start going on the next line. And I'm going to take this side, I'm going to fold it down. And ideally, this miter is going to meet where the corner is, right where this tip of the binding is. You can manipulate that if it isn't happening on its own. So now I need to tack this down. So usually I take 2 or 3 stitches here, just starting in the side of the binding that we just did and traveling down the corner. And then I'm going to take one more tiny stitch coming right out at the tip of where that miter is and where that meets the edge of the binding. So I've got my tip of the miter right here and then my binding's right there. I'm going to take one more stitch into the backing fabric and batting, and then bringing it out right on that miter. That kind of tacks everything in place and helps keep it where it should be. Just lost my thread. Happens. All right, get that rethreaded. And then you can just continue going all the way down. All right, I'm going to show you real quick how to tie off your knot so that way you can start a new thread, and then that's it. You know everything you need to know to make this quilt. When I learned how to do this, it was so awesome. So we're going to do a quilter's knot again, but we're going to do it on the needle in place. So I'm wrapping the thread around 3 times, and I've got the needle positioned pretty close to the edge of the binding. Now I'm going to pinch those loops that I wrapped around, pull everything tight again, and now I've got a nice loop that's about a ½ inch or so away from the edge of my binding. So for this stitch, I just take a little bit longer travel and get everything folded over there. I'm going to go ahead and put it in like normal, but instead of coming out about a 1/4 to a 1/3 of an inch away, I'm coming down about a ½ inch. Give that a tug. I heard that pop there, maybe you guys did too. And now I'm good to cut this. And so I ended right here. And so when I start my new thread, I'm going to start a couple of stitches back. I'll probably start right in this corner, and I'll bury that thread again and hide that knot and then keep on stitching. The reason why I leave a little bit extra space is because that way I'm able to sort of catch that a couple of times, and I feel like it makes it a little bit more secure. I've never had a problem with my binding coming undone, and if it ever did, you could just stitch it back down. It's not like the end of the world. Well, that's it. We have covered a ton in this video. We now know how to prepare your binding, sew it to the quilt top, do a miter corner, and do continuous binding to join your edges so you can't tell where you started or stopped. And we also have covered how to hand stitch it down to the back. So we covered a ton, but this is it. This is the last bit of sewing that you have to do for your quilt. And so just put on a favorite movie or Netflix. Anything that's not action and you don't have to watch the TV is great for. Just something that can kind of be going on and help make it go faster. If this is your first time doing it and your hands are not used to that motion, maybe spread it out over a couple of nights so that your hands don't get tired. But it's a lot of fun. I can probably do this one while watching a movie, but I've been doing it for a while, so don't feel like you need to go as fast as I do when you're sewing. I'm going to switch to black thread and finish this up, and that'll be real exciting. If you haven't already, I don't know how you could have gotten this far without it, but make sure you head over to shop.quiltaddictsanonymous.com to get your free pattern to go with this video tutorial series. It's called the Split 9 patch. You can search for it, or we'll have it in a link in the video description down below. You're going to get all the instructions you need to create this quilt top. You can use the videos to follow along to make your first quilt. Plus, we're going to send you a coupon code that gives you a discount on your first purchase from us, so that way you can afford to get really nice, good quality quilting materials for your first quilt so you can have a really good experience. Well, thanks so much for following along, and make sure you watch our final video about how to sew a quilt label, and then also how to care for your quilt and what kind of soaps and things you should use. Thank you so much for following along with our beginner quilting video tutorial series, and until next time, happy quilting. QT Fabrics proudly sponsors this video tutorial series from Quilt Addicts Anonymous. Make sure you join in the fabric fun over at qtfabrics.com. They imagine so you can create.